Hi, friends. This is Reverend Daniel Gregoire, minister of the Unitarian Universalist Society of Grafton and Upton, and this is a version of the sermon that I delivered on Sunday at my church, Sunday, October the 9th, and the title of that sermon is God is Red. Our ultimate concern in life has the ability to conform us to the world as it is now, or to open us up to the world as it could and should be. To use the language of the mid-20th century theologian Paul Tillich, God can be understood as our ultimate concern. This deity is imbued with all of the power and authority that we lend to it by our concern. If our concern, for example, is with success, then our God becomes a God of success. If it is pain or anxiety, then ours will be a God demanding a never-ending string of sacrifices upon the altars of fear and isolation. Yet, if our ultimate concern is one of interdependence and interconnection, well, we can just begin to imagine what type of God would be focused on that aspect and what kind of demands would be made on us as a result. Perhaps that God would encourage us towards greater acts of service and justice, that God would be patient towards us and allow us to be patient towards others. Now, if our ultimate concern is one having to do with property, power, domination, judgment, or scarcity, then we will surround ourselves with the very powerful symbols, stories, and ritual objects that reinforce and celebrate those gods. And such tyrannical gods will give us dominion over the earth and all of its creatures, and will fuel our zeal for expansion, colonialism, neocolonialism, and the continued denigration and exploitation of people, resources, land. But not only that, those gods, the gods of greed, the gods of scarcity, they cut us off from all the things that matter. We will know our gods by the acts that they inspire and the deeds done in their name, and such knowledge has the power to set us free. In 1647, the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, wrote an entry praising the missionary work of a certain John Eliot of Cambridge in England. Eliot was a Puritan minister of the First Church of Roxbury, and he translated the Bible into Algonquian, the language of the Native Americans in this part of the country. This was a tremendous accomplishment. It meant, as Winthrop had hoped, that the native peoples were one step closer to becoming Christian, one step closer to forming their own clergy, and finally living peacefully alongside the European settlers and adopting their culture and the worldview of the English, although they would never quite achieve the same status as the English. Winthrop wrote, "The Indians are usually very attentive and keep their children so quiet as to cause no disturbance. Some of them began to seriously become affected and to understand the things of God, and they were generally ready to reform whatsoever they were told to be against the Word of God." Winthrop goes on to describe their reformation. They stopped from their sorcery, which they call powwowing, he writes, their whoredoms and idleness. John Eliot was known as the apostle to the Indians, and he established a series of praying towns in what would eventually become the state of Massachusetts. Grafton, where we are today, was one of those praying towns. It was a place where Christian Indians were allowed to live with some degree of autonomy. In the Hassanamisco plantation, as it was known, as Grafton was known, the praying Indians would hold services, farm the land, and live in a way that would replicate the lifestyles of the English. But this was a very short history, and this project would be very short-lived. The praying Indian towns did not last very long, and a war broke out between the English and the Indians in 1675 that ultimately ended that project, or perhaps revealed its truest aim, which at its heart was to divest the Indians of their ancestral lands in New England. Nearly all of the parcels of land that belonged to the Native Americans were divided among white settlers, except for 3 acres on Brigham Hill. Now, the experience of bringing Christianity to Native Americans could not be described as a success, at least not ultimately. And how could it be? The missionaries, no matter how sincere they were in their desire to spread the quote-unquote good news, they were ultimately agents of empire, offering a religion not connected to the experiences of the Nipmuc, the Wampanoag, or any of the other native peoples who populated this land. Christianity and European culture was ultimately ushered in with the full brutality of invasion and conquest. And that's hardly the conditions under which you want to bring in a new religious system. Now, interestingly, the justification for this conquest, and the justification for all conquests, almost always comes after the fact, and they draw upon the religious traditions of the conquerors. John Winthrop wanted to recreate a holy city on a hill, a new Jerusalem, referring to the language found in the Bible. The colonists were inspired in many cases by a God who looked like them, was on their side, who justified their actions in the New World, especially their dominion over the lands and over the people they found there. In John Winthrop's diary, he described how the native peoples would ask, how come some people have more, the Europeans, and why others have so little, the Indians? And the record states that Eliot and others like him would reply that the status quo was ordered this way by their God, and that it is God's will for some to be dominators and for others to be dominated. But I think that there must have been something far more fundamental, an underlying assumption shared among the Native Americans that made it virtually impossible to reconcile their understanding of the cosmos with what the English, the French, the Spanish, or any other missionary, what they were presenting. Vine Deloria, in a book titled God is Red, A Native View of Religion, describes this disconnect by saying, there are serious questions whether Indian tribes actually had any conception of religion or deity at all. Wherever we find Indians, and whenever we inquire about their idea of God, they tell us that beneath the surface of the physical universe, there is a mysterious spiritual power, which cannot be described in human images, and that must remain always the great mystery. Deloria reconciles the Christian worldview with the Native American worldview, what he calls Indian, by saying that they cannot be reconciled. They are fundamentally different. He says that the Indians of diverse native cultures largely see themselves as existing in deep relationship to their surroundings, the land, while Christians, and I think it can be said that all of us, because all of us are influenced by the dominant Christian and Western narratives, we see ourselves as over and above our fellow creatures. And in the same way that our God is over and above the natural world, over which we have dominion. This is our worldview. There's a strict line between the spiritual and the material. In the Indian worldview, the natural world is integral to human ambition and activities, not separate from it. Humans are on the same exact level as other animals, and all life can be described as created in a divine image, not just human life. There is no separation between church and state. All of it is a religious experience. All of it is secular experience simultaneously. There simply aren't any divisions between the two. And if we refer to the language of Tillich, we might say that our ultimate concern, however we label it, largely supports our present activity on the landscape we call home. Our God is not a God of kinship with creation or even with other people. Our God is something different from that, a God of acquisition, a God of transportation, a God that allows us to exercise the dominion over the land that we seem to enjoy. Vine Deloria, in giving his book the title God is Red, is using a rhetorical device that goes back to the founding of the liberation theology movement in Central and South America in the 1960s and 70s. This was a movement that coincided with the liberation movements of that time. For example, the Black Liberation Movement, women's liberation, gay liberation, the liberation of Native Americans, Chicanos, and people with disabilities. People, all of them, reclaiming their sense of worth and dignity while demanding access to the wealth often generated through their labors and exploitations by a system of oppression supported largely by the God of the conquerors. If we change our understanding of the nature of things, then we will change our approach to life on earth. In claiming a red God, Deloria and others like him are signaling their solidarity, and that their solidarity is to the earth and its people and all life. A red God is ultimately a great spirit and a great mystery that is deeply woven into the fabric of creation and is creation itself. It is important to remember that loving and worship and service, work and play, and justice and compassion are all part of the same act, all part of a natural response to being alive. This is an understanding that comes to us from a red God. And as a reading from Black Elk, the holy man of the Sioux Nation, reminds us that we should understand prayer as something that we do in our hearts and as something that the cottonwood tree does with the rustling of its branches in the wind. This is from our reading. Perhaps you have noticed that even in the lightest breeze, you can hear the voice of the cottonwood tree. This, we understand, is its prayer to the Great Spirit. For not only men, but all things and all beings pray to him, continually, in different ways. For the Great Spirit is everywhere. He hears whatever is on our minds and hearts, and it is not necessary to speak to him in a loud voice. A red God is a God that is comprehensible to the Indians. It is a God of the land and the physical universe, and that ultimate concern for land reminds us that the holy is wherever we are, and this kind of knowledge sets us free. As Unitarian Universalists, we draw inspiration from the world and the mysteries of life. We also recognize as one of our principles the interdependence and interconnectedness of all life. We say that we are part of the web, not the web, a part of it. This is our seventh principle. I believe that ours is a faith that sets us free, and not just because of what we believe or don't believe. Rather, it's our understanding of the world and the actions inspired by that understanding. It is theory, theology, and practice all rolled up into one. And that is where the liberation comes from. In A Reason for Hope by the Unitarian Universalist minister Fred Muir, he describes our faith as one where we actively join with others in the fight for human dignity and justice, and that we refuse the idolatries of individualism, and there are many of them, and we embrace community. And I would go a step further and say that our faith moves us into solidarity with all life, the land we share. It moves us into solidarity with the planet. It is a faith that does not and could not be practiced in eagerness and allow for domination or colonialism. Our faith is one that tends towards greater freedom, inclusion, and compassion. As it is in the case of the native peoples of this hemisphere, the so-called New World, their worldview and ours has something of great value to teach us. In fact, the red God has something to teach us about the true relationship, our true relationship to creation. This story is rather a useful counter-narrative to the ancient tale of dominion over the earth and over the majority of its peoples and life forms that has long characterized the God of the Semitic peoples of the ancient Near East, a God who increasingly became white in the march of Christianity towards the West. I recognize that our faith is theologically and philosophically pluralistic, so we, as Unitarians, draw from many sources of inspiration. We have many beliefs and different names for the holy. Whether or not we believe in something that we might call a god, gods, goddesses, higher power, great spirit, great mystery, wonder, what have you, it doesn't matter. But what does matter is this, that we name the holy, that we have stories, songs, and symbols that more fully flesh out the values that we hold dear. Otherwise, we run the risk of slipping into actions that show allegiance to other gods and powers. Ultimate concerns of success, fear, anxiety, loneliness, gods of greed, domination, or nationalism, these gods are crafty, and they have a way of working themselves into the empty spaces in our unconscious mind and conscious actions. So we have to be on guard for those and other influences. It's worth us asking from time to time who or what is inspiring our actions in this moment. Now think about that. Who or what is inspiring our actions in this moment? So I offer this to you, to all of us, a vision of a red God, one who is a great mystery, ever present in the environment, linking us to all life. A God who makes no distinctions between human, bird, tree, rock, direction, water. A God of interdependence, and a God of deep, deep memory. A great spirit who is everywhere, hearing what is on our minds and hearts. A spirit that doesn't demand us to speak in a loud voice. I offer this vision because it is one that sets us free and inspires actions that our world so desperately needs. How might a red God inspire you? Remember the red God, the ancient God of the land, a power worshipped silently in the hearts and minds and in the drumbeat for tens of thousands of years. Remember the people of this God, who is a great mystery and a great spirit. They are the original inhabitants of this land. Remember the red God who is of the earth and of all of its creatures. This is a God whose object is not to redeem us or reform us or aid us in escaping this world, but one who encourages us to live more fully, more interdependently, more deeply into the web of life. May it be so, and amen.